Excellent. We will now move on to our final panelist, who is Seth Wilder. Seth's a doctoral student in moving image studies in the School of Film, Media, and Theater at Georgia State University. His research focuses principally on historiography, global cinemas, and aesthetics and their relationship to the auteur concept. Seth will be delivering a paper entitled Consuming Leftovers in the Time of COVID-19, a Pandemic and the Retextualization of an HBO Series. Welcome, Seth.
Thank you. Hopefully you can all hear me. My computer's been a bit wonky. So interestingly enough, because I am really a cinema person, it seems like everything that I'm getting interested in is TV based, so I'm gonna go with it. This is about a TV series. Okay, to begin, and I don't have any visuals with this, in part because my computer is wonky. Although there is some debate within the critical community concerning its bingeability, could there be a more appropriate title for a series to binge watch while socially distancing in 2021 than The Leftovers? It evokes food and its consumption, not unlike the use of binge in relation to contemporary media consumption. Even more so, Leftovers suggests something already in the living space instead of something that requires journeying out into public. Among the more compelling features of the current streaming service-based, media-saturated era is the tendency towards asynchronous serialized programming consumption. More than ever, the proliferation of streaming has encouraged audiences to discover and rediscover series and for the audiences to binge them, consuming them more rapidly than initially possible. Through its concomitant lockdown orders and the embrace of social distancing, the coronavirus pandemic's arrival has accelerated these trends. More time spent at home, often more time spent alone, and a more pronounced impulse towards the kinds of distraction televisual entertainment promises all encourage viewers to dig into the television archives. Amid this health crisis, HBO has launched its over-the-top streaming service, HBO Max, which has opened up that network's library of original programming to the broader audience who does not subscribe to pay television services. Included among those offerings is The Leftovers, which initially ran on the premium service between 2014 and 2017. A tale of secular apocalypse, the series charts the traumatic aftermath of an inexplicable event whereby 2% of the Earth's population has suddenly vanished. Co-created by TV veteran Damon Lindelof and Tom Perrotta, author of the 2011 novel on which it is based, at least the first season, The Leftovers tells the story of what happens a few years into the aftermath of this traumatic event. Primarily focused on the members of a wholly non-departed but no longer intact family, the Garveys, and others in their orbit, the series unfolds predominantly over a period starting 3 years after this event, which is known as the sudden departure, and albeit with a coda that transpires decades later, culminating around its 7th anniversary for reasons that will become clear below. Although each of the series' seasons mostly follows the same cast of characters, the setting shifts from upstate Mapleton, New York in season 1 to Jarden or Miracle, Texas for season 2, before settling in Australia for the 3rd and final season. As a series so thoroughly concentrated on the trauma of loss, the overall tone and mood are generally solemn, even grim. Admittedly, there's more than a touch of dark serendipity in examining this series through the lens of a pandemic unforeseen at the time of the series' creation and initial airing. Ultimately a tale of the impact of loss on those left behind, the series takes on an unnerving and unexpected resonance during a global public health emergency where the cumulative impact on the population has resulted in mass casualties and large-scale human suffering, despite the morbidity and mortality figures remaining small as percentages. One shared lesson of COVID-19 and The Leftovers' departures is that these small percentages can yield unsettlingly large numbers when applied to global populations. More to the point, although it is less inexplicable, the irresolution of this ongoing pandemic finds uncanny eschatological parallels in the insolubility of these televisual sudden departures. Due to the highly contagious nature of the novel coronavirus and the potentially severe course of the disease it can cause, one governing principle of public health policy has been to encourage or even insist that members of the general public maintain social distancing as much as feasible. Among other things, this has meant minimizing contact with other people, particularly in non-household settings. This social distancing has tended to produce a greater sense of social isolation, and in that socially isolated landscape, television has enjoyed a renewed significance in day-to-day life. While viewing and consuming patterns and rationales are varied and individualized in a media environment where streaming content has become the norm, particularly in the early months of the so-called lockdowns precipitated by the pandemic, viewing has often been framed in terms of comfort TV. The use of the term comfort invokes the concept of comfort food, which is food consumed for anxiolytic, emotionally soothing effects. Similarly, comfort TV is a model of media consumption where the viewer selects programming based on its ability to reduce anxiety or even foster the sense of normalcy and community that the health crisis has foreclosed. One idea here is that viewing is so selected is particularly amenable to binging, that is, watching multiple episodes in a single sitting. Because of its subject matter and its treatment, The Leftovers is an improbable choice for such viewing. A series preoccupied with interrogating myriad forms of perseverance in the face of inexplicable loss, it represents a viewing experience more readily framed as discomfort or discomfiting TV. If anything, the shadow of loss that looms over the current public health crisis has rendered the series even less comfortable than when it originally aired. Equally, the discomfort is intensified when the series is binged, rather than consumed at the one episode per week tempo of its original broadcast. Although the story it presents is distinct from the current real-world crisis of novel contagion, the pervasive grief and loss built into the interactions between the series' characters, reinforces feelings of isolation rather than fostering a sense of comfort and community. And this is combined with a situation where things seem significantly abnormal rather than reflective of a sense of the return to normalcy. On the contrary, the series presents a scenario where the very idea of life returning to the way things were before the departures remains elusive and unthinkable, which has uncanny parallels with the current circumstance where the notion of returning to past normalcy becomes ever more remote with the passage of time. Put differently, the viewing experience of The Leftovers is retextualized in and by the pandemic. Combining theoretical work by Raymond Williams, Jonathan Gray, John Fisk, and others, television scholar Taylor Miller coined the term retextualization to stand in for how viewing contexts frame the televisual experience. Although Miller is more concerned with how syndication and reruns are intentionally reframed in different programming contexts and how these produce distinct texts that deserve to be treated on those terms, the framework he offers is instrumental in making sense of the changed viewing experience of The Leftovers during this public crisis. Retextualization expands the field of the televisual intertext and paratext. It recognizes another layer of intertextual significance, with the pre-pandemic viewing of The Leftovers becoming a paratext to pandemic-era viewing that cannot help but be shaped by this health crisis. This is similar to how the series is a paratext to the novel that serves as its jumping-off point. The series framed by its own historical cultural viewership context, which is distinct from that of the novel. However, unlike the adaptation from the novel to television, even absent changes to the episode's contents, a new text is produced by and during the pandemic. The current circumstances render The Leftovers a distinct object, in other words. The series has generally been described in apocalyptic terms, but what does it mean to say that The Leftovers is apocalyptic? Unlike the more common use of the term in popular discourse, where it tends to reflect wide-scale societal collapse and its aftermath, the loss entailed by the sudden departure of 2% of the human population does not permanently upend or fundamentally restructure society. While it is not a stretch to suggest that the series is dystopic, it is a dystopia distinct from the more typical kind. Instead, The Leftovers presents something more akin to the accumulation of personal tragedies that together form its pervasive traumatic sense of loss. As in the present crisis, even as things are different and will likely never be what they once were, there remain societal continuities. Governments are left intact. The economic system has resumed much of its daily reproduction. Folks still go to work and school and live lives, albeit lives that have been touched, shaped, and diminished by these losses. Still, especially when viewed during the pandemic, framing the series in apocalyptic terms proves revelatory. Pun intended. The biblical understanding of apocalypse represents a particular form of prophecy, not one telling the future, but one where highly symbolic imagery reveals present circumstances. In a way that was not apparent before the pandemic, in the COVID-19 era, The Leftovers is revealed to be just such an apocalyptic narrative. It is shown to be a series that, in its fictional scenario, reveals uncomfortable truths about our present circumstances, including spotlighting deep societal fractures that, as it turns out, even a global crisis does not ameliorate, but instead exacerbates. As has been true of the responses to the pandemic, rather than bringing humanity together in the shared experience of suffering and loss, The Leftovers' departures have further fractured society. Keeping with the biblical theme, the series is eschatological, albeit reflective of an arguably secular form of eschatology, rather than the sort of biblical end of days recorded in Revelation. The series includes a pastor who is convinced that the departures were not the Christian rapture due to the vanished population's heterogeneity, with believers and non-believers counted among the departed. Moreover, the series includes a character who becomes convinced of the religious significance of the 7th anniversary of the sudden departures and follows what he sees as portents of God's final judgment to Australia, where near the series' conclusion, no such judgment is forthcoming. There's a there's a flood or there's historic rains, but they recede and things turn out to be pretty okay. Instead, although many people turn to religion for answers, the series offers a story without a religious explanation, such as God's judgment of humanity. The Leftovers presents a particularly intriguing take on the eschatological in that, while it does appear as if something has ended, and not offering an answer to the question of what caused this heterogeneous cross-section of humanity to vanish, it simultaneously offers a televisual world poised in irresolution. This resonates deeply with the current health crisis, which, while not so wholly inexplicable, feels simultaneously like the end of something and the midst of an as yet unresolved crisis. Hopefully it will be resolved soon. What is the ending that the series chronicles? It would be too strong to assert that the series marks the ending of neoliberal capitalism. However, it pushes against the system's limits, revealing the limitations of a society built on and sustained by material consumption, which likewise resonates with the present moment's crisis. In The Leftovers, material pursuits are revealed to be hollow and unfulfilling, and even more so, shown to be a method of forgetting, for papering over the cracks represented by the loss. With a hint of irony, it is noted that Frankfurt School theorist Theodor Adorno once said, "Advancing bourgeois society liquidates memory, time, recollection as irrational leftovers of the past." Adorno's Marxist thoughts concerning the bourgeoisie's liquidation of memory, fostered through material pursuits, find counterintuitive embodiment in the guilty remnant in The Leftovers, an aesthetic religious sect that, in jettisoning their past lives, giving up their prior employment, refusing to speak, and rejecting material comforts and objects, devotes itself to forcing the society around them to remember the loss represented by the departures. They undertake escalating acts of cruelty, targeting and silently following people who are marked by losses, breaking into their homes to steal photographs of those that departed, culminating at the end of the first season in placing photorealistic dolls modeled after the departed and dressed in their clothes in the homes of those that they've left behind. Rather than getting on with life, this group operates on the belief that the departures were the judgment, the end of the world has already transpired, and the surrounding culture must continue to confront the losses as a present effect rather than processing them as personal grief brought to livable terms to get on with life. They embody the Benjaminian admonition to redeem the future and the present through attention to the past. In this case, denying neoliberal capitalism's desire to liquidate recollection by undermining its forward-leaning impulses in consumption. Their annihilation at the hands of the government in a town converted into a tourist attraction because it suffered no departures in 2011 reveals the intractability of capitalism and the seeming impossibility of imagining any replacement paradigm, even in the aftermath or face of a global crisis that brings its shortcomings into sharp relief. For all its grimness, the series ends on a reserved note of hope, with two of its central characters reconnecting decades later in a scenario that offers both a resolution to the departed and the promise of continuity in this couple's romantic relationship. Although the series does not answer why the suddenly departed vanished, it does offer an answer to where they ended up, an alternate Earth now composed of 2% of the human population. Unexpectedly, this reframes the trauma and loss the series has chronicled by underlining that the loss was experienced by those left behind as well as those who left. This reconnection between two characters who were among those left behind and whose losses take different forms, with Kevin Garvey having not actually lost any members of his family, but having had his family fractured by the other losses, and Nora Dunn, the woman, having lost her entire immediate family. Encourages the possibility of a transformed reconciliation in the aftermath of trauma and loss. Amid the current public health crisis, this ending reads as particularly hopeful. In this reading, it suggests not merely that this pandemic will pass, but that its resolution offers an opportunity for reconciliation and transformation if only these can and will be seized. Thank you.